Piers Paul Reed is rare among novelists for being a practicing Catholic who had a big hit with a factual book about those who survived a plane crash staying alive by eating those who didn't. The book could have unbalanced his career from the start, but he didn't let that happen.
Well, you're professionally known as Piers Paul Reed, which is the best writer's name of the 20th century.
Thank you.
And now the 21st. But we all call you Jay, because is that your real name? Or
It's a nickname which comes from Jiminy. Before I was born, there was a cricket stuck in a pipe.
Jiminy Cricket.
And the moment I was born, it stopped chirping. So my father said he's got the transmigrated soul of the cricket.
So that's why you're called
I was called Jiminy Cricket. Until I was 16, I was introduced as Jiminy, and Jay was the nickname for Jiminy.
I've known you more than 20 years and I never knew that. You see,
Yeah.
that's the point of doing this kind of conversation.
Yeah.
Right.
And then when I was 16, my father said, you can't go through life calling yourself Jiminy or Jay, so you've got to use the name Piers. So I started calling myself Piers, and now half my friends, 45% of my friends call me Piers, others call me Jay, and there are a few who still call me Jiminy.
And your father made the decision, and your father, not all that many people know, was actually Herbert Reed himself, the great man.
Yeah, well.
Great father. Never easy having a great father.
No, he was a sweet man. He was very, very kind, and so, you know, I didn't feel I was growing up in the shadow of anything.
Did he feel he was in the shadow of World War I? Not many people have realised just what a great writer he is about World War I, because he did so many other things. If he'd just done that, it'd be one of the great evocations of the Western Front.
Yes, I think he did. I think partly because he survived it. You know, he went in at the start. He was a student at Leeds University, and he didn't have any money, so to get free holidays in the country, he joined the officers' training, you know, the OTC, and used to go out. And then suddenly, after a year of university at Leeds, the war came, and he had to join up immediately. And he not only survived the war, the only wound he had was when a very pistol went up his sleeve. And he was decorated. He got 2 decorations for valour, and I think he came out with a sense that he had he'd been saved for something.
Life.
Yeah, and a mission, and his mission became modern art.
Yeah, and civilization in general, and modern art in particular. In fact, he introduced me to modern art, and in Australia in the late 50s, his book Art Now was one of the books that opened up 20th century art to me. Yes. And you never get over that kind of gratitude.
Yeah, good.
There's always a personality leads you to a great experience. And I admired everything about him. And in Australia, of course, he was doubly famous because when the Ern Malley hoax happened, I'm not so sure you know much about it in England,
no.
but 2 Australian poets pretended to be a surrealist poet to hoax a magazine. And the hoax worked. And your father was the man who pointed out 2 poets can't decide to write bad poetry. It's not a hoax. It's probably the best stuff they ever did. And his authoritative voice resonated and stayed with me. It taught me something.
I didn't know.
He's a great teacher. Yes. He's a great teacher. And it's fair to say, I think, that Alive is the book that you're most famous for, which is really a book about a plane crashing and the people on it ate each other because there was nothing else to eat. And it was certainly the first.
They ate the dead bodies. They didn't. They didn't eat each other living.
Is it? And that one is still with us in the sense that a movie got made of it, and people know about it.
It sold phenomenally well all over the world.
There's a paradox here that I'd like to raise with you, because I think the book, apart from the quality of the writing, depended on 2 things. There would seem to be a case of evil operating in the world, and also it was unusual, and something's happened between then and now. For one thing, cannibalism has become quite fashionable, if you noticed.
Yes, yes. Well, I think it was the first opportunity to study a case of cannibalism and describe the kind of mental process that went on when they made the decision. And I think it was quite ennobling in that I think the book shows that they didn't just sort of deteriorate into savages, but actually made a very rational and considered decision that this was the only way to survive, the only way to see their friends again, their family above all.
Well, I was impressed by the way the book raised questions of good and evil, and all your books do, because you're a religious writer in the sense you're a religious man, but are you a religious writer, if you get me?
It's very difficult to decide for oneself what sort of writer one is, I think. I was raised as a Catholic and I've kept the Catholic faith, and I think my faith and the values that come from it certainly permeate all my writing, whether it's fiction or non-fiction. but I've also been interested in other things such as love and sex and politics, and some of my more pious Catholic readers are always rather appalled by some of my novels because some of the sort of steamy scenes seem to them.
If one were a Catholic writer, one would rather want some of your Catholic audience to be appalled, wouldn't
Yes.
It's true that the Catholic writers have been Catholic mavericks in the English tradition anyway. I'm thinking of
Graham Greene.
Isle of War, Green,
Yes,
Graham Greene.
yes.
Muriel Spark, is she a Catholic?
Yes,
Yes.
indeed.
In the case of Greene, for example, unless he was on the verge of heresy all the time, he wouldn't be as interesting as he is, would he?
No, but War is a traditional Catholic.
But he was a convert, wasn't he?
They were both converts. Yes.
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 And sometimes the convert is more zealous than the
Yes.
people born into the faith.
Yes.
I think some of War's Catholic friends actually tried to tell him to cool down.
Yes. 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 He became very sort of dogmatic and fanatical in a sense.
But I think it's fair to say that if Graham Greene hadn't been on the verge of heresy all the time, he would be a lot less interesting Catholic writer.
Yes. I mean, I knew Graham Greene, and he was very kind to me, and I was very fond of him. But I think, as a Catholic, there was something slightly perverse about his Catholicism. I mean,
Well, one thing, he was a great libertine, wasn't he?
he was a great libertine, and particularly what we found out afterwards, in these biographies,
Which we find fascinating.
which we find fascinating. But I can't help feeling he's slightly sort of perverse. That kind of. Funnily enough, I was reading about for my new novel. I was reading up about Rasputin, and Rasputin and Graham Greene had rather the same attitude. God loves the sinner, so unless you sin,
Let's sin. Yes.
let's sin. Yeah.
Rather Baudelaire's view, but I think there are limits to it, and for Greene there didn't seem to be any limits at all. And it got into the novels too. He gave, for example, I think Scobie. Which book is it? Scobie's in the heart of the matter, isn't he? He gave Scobie an anguish about sinning, which one rather felt that Greene himself didn't share.
I know.
Did you feel that at the time when you knew him, that there was an element of hypocrisy? Is hypocrisy the wrong word? There was a disparity between the views he was professing and his behaviour, which is really unbridgeable.
Yes, and I certainly think he sort of dumped rather too easily a lot of the values that go with Catholicism, marriage, family life.
You're serious about this stuff, aren't you?
I am, yes.
You've lived to your principles. I'm not saying if you haven't, tell us.
I mean, you're wearing black, so you could be a priest in the confessional, but perhaps this isn't the moment. Certainly, I've tried to, yes. And to me, family life is very important. Marriage is very important.
I think Graham Greene, if caught in flagrante, which he wasn't, except posthumously, would have said it was a question of epistemology. If he hadn't lived like that, there were things he wouldn't have known.
Yes.
Does that ever strike you? That?
Well, I like to think that the imagination can reach parts that experience may not reach. I mean, I've written some quite tough scenes in my novels. I mean, I've written several novels set around the First World War, and I've gone into concentration camps, I've gone into the minds of Nazis and mass killers and that sort of thing, and I don't think one has to experience that to be able to empathise to some extent.
One thing that Catholicism guarantees is that there's such a thing as evil that can be contemplated, and even the work of Satan, without being a manichae. I'm not so sure. I'm not religious, but I think I probably am a manichae. I sometimes think that evil has a mind.
Yes,
a soul.
yes. Well, I believe evil has a mind. I mean, I believe that in the personal devil, because I think Satan. Yes, I think Satan is a genius. I think he does things which only a genius could dream out.
I think so. The more I read about the Third Reich, the more I think that Hitler was Satan's representative.
Yeah.
It's just Satan isn't a word I can use, but on the other hand, satanic is a word I can't do without.
Yes, yes.
Hitler had an imagination. He had an economical satanic genius by which he could begin something which would have horrendous consequences, and he knew what they were.
Yeah.
If you crowd people together, they do certain things, for example. If you isolate them from society, certain miseries will ensue. He seemed to guess it all, and it was a master plan. And he won his war, really, didn't he? That war, the war against the innocent. So where was God?
God was
moving in mysterious ways.
No, he was weeping, if you like, I think.
Yes.
He gives man freedom, and this is how he uses it. But if he didn't give man that freedom, and didn't give the devil that freedom to tempt man to do evil, then we wouldn't be as gods.
To me, it's still the insoluble problem. I'm there, I think, with Ivan Karamazov, not Dmitri, Ivan, and said he wished he wished God was existed so that he could argue with him
Yes.
and ask for an explanation.
Yes.
And I still want an explanation. I think of the children in the concentration camps at Christmas and the snow's coming down. And why didn't God come with the snowflakes to save them? And obviously, if you say that God can't do that because he's given us this freedom to choose, well, he didn't give the children the freedom to choose.
No. I mean, I think there is a sort of paradox in Christian belief, which is that on the one hand we pray for God's intervention. You know, I've got toothache, you know, like St. Augustine prayed to God to get rid of his toothache. And we believe, or I believe, that God does sometimes intervene to help us out in various ways. But then he doesn't intervene in other ways, so it's certainly a mystery. But I think I accept the general principle that if man is to be like God, I mean, having eaten the fruit of the tree of good and evil, then he has to be able to be evil. We have to be able to choose evil, otherwise we'd be like the animals. We'd just live according to instinct, and we'd have that kind of natural innocence which animals have, even when they're devouring and tearing to pieces, you know, the cat's killing the thrush and tearing it to pieces. You know, we have the knowledge of good and evil, but to be godlike, we have to have the choice to do evil.
I'm bound to say it's a set of values. It's more than a set of values. It's an intellectual construction that I envy. And if I was capable of belief, I'd be a happier man, a much happier man. I think it was a wonderful thing Evelyn Waugh once said. Evelyn Waugh had been caught behaving abominably to someone with his usual snobbish rudeness, his truly unforgivable hauteur. And in an abashed moment he said, "You've got no idea how much worse I would be if I was not a Catholic."
Yes.
Is there something to that? Does faith do something for the personality?
I think, I mean, the Catholic hypothesis is that the grace of God should infuse you and make you a better person, yes. And, you know, I'm very conscious of the grace of God and my need of the grace of God, and I certainly think it has, you know, I think from reading my novels, or from writing my novels, I realise that I have potential for great evil, and if the fact that I've only acted it out in writing fiction and haven't acted it out in life, I would say that thanks to the grace of God.
I think one of the things that people of faith now have to face is that we are moving into a faithless age, at least in the liberal democratic West.
Yes.
And although in many ways it's a society that one abominates for its triviality and so on, it still seems to me preferable to those areas where faith is alive, well, healthy and violent.
I quite agree. Nearly all the great sort of fissures in the world are caused by religion. But that could be the genius of the devil, you see.
Ah.
That he perverts, you know, what is good to evil.
I rather hope that he and God aren't hand in hand. I forgot what the Manichaean view is. My view is Manichaean if I think evil has a mind, isn't it?
The Manichaean view is that all matter is evil, and that good is spirit. I mean, and that there are two equal gods, really. The God of evil and the God of good. And is that what you believe?
Yes, roughly. I'm actually appalled by the increasing atomization of liberal democratic society, to which my commitment is complete. My own problem is that the society I always wish for is coming true. It's more equal. It's less unjust. But the people's potential has not been released to higher things and creativity and appreciation of the arts. Au contraire.
No, it's a levelling down.
It's heading towards Big Brother as fast as it can go.
Yeah.
And I stand back appalled, and all I can think is, well, it's very boring. But the boring is better than what the excitement used to be. This is better than fighting Nazism. This is better than the Soviet Union being there. We're getting, in many ways, the society we want. But it's not particularly elevating, and it leaves you with the question of how much you can elevate yourself by hauling on your own bootstraps, by being interested in civilized things. It would be nice to know that the higher values were shared, and it's fairly obvious they're not going to be, unless there's some kind of recreation of religious belief, unless a church re-establishes itself, because the established church in this country is not Catholic.
No.
It's the Church of England, which has gone happy-slappy and guitar playing as fast as anyone could have ever believed.
Yes, and has downplayed the sort of more controversial and more challenging aspects of Christian belief, I would say. For example, they never mention Satan these days. Nor, for that matter, do the Catholics much. But
do you look on at the antics of the Anglican Church pleased or appalled? You ought to be pleased.
Well, we're all meant to be very ecumenical these days. But I have to say that when I look at the Anglican Church, I think, well, that's the church that isn't built on the rock of Peter. Yeah, I do think that.
Yeah.
And I do think that the way that this Pope in particular has stood out against the sort of certain modern trends is proof.
You prefer your Pope's reactionary in that sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it takes you back to Paul, so you didn't prefer him. Was it John? Who was the...
John Paul.
John
No, Paul John the 23rd was the one that liberals like to say was a very liberal Pope. Actually, he was extremely traditionalist and would have been absolutely appalled by many of the things that happened as a result of the Vatican Council.
The Evil War was gutted when the Church renounced the Latin...
Yes.
The Latin liturgy.
Yes.
And they brought in a vernacular liturgy, and he hadn't joined the Church for that. In other words, he got hoisted on his own petard. He joined the Church for its authority, and the Church's authority he decided on populism.
Yes.
And it left him desolate. There's the same trend in the Catholic Church, if there is one, do the same to you. Suppose you weren't allowed to hear Latin again in a church, for example.
It's very interesting, actually, to study the reaction to the Vatican Council of Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene, because they both went different ways. He was appalled by the changes, and
Waugh was,
yes, and retired into his shell, as it were. I mean, he accepted the authority of the Church, and you know, he was the obedient son of the Church. Whereas Graham actually really, in some of his novels, you notice he took on board the whole liberal development that followed the Vatican Council, and to some extent, you see with the Burnt-out case, I won't say he lost his faith, because you know he died a good Catholic, but he certainly abandoned some of the more sort of metaphysical aspects of Catholic belief.
I'm glad that's what I thought a Burnt-out case was about, and I'm glad to hear it confirmed from someone on the outside as well.
So far as I judge it that way, but I'm between the two stools, actually. I mean, I do miss the Latin Mass. I do think the liturgy of the old Tridentine Mass had a sort of mystery and beauty about it, which enabled me to have faith when I was a child. And I think it's been very difficult for my children to have faith because of the banality of the liturgy. Yes. On the other hand, you know, I was very bad at Latin. I never understood a word of what was going on. I learnt a lot of the responses to the Mass, parrot fashion, and things like, you know, the kiss of peace, which we have nowadays when everybody shakes hands at a certain point, which some traditionalist Catholics cannot bear. I like that.
But the whole idea of the Latin liturgy was you did learn it parrot fashion. That's the way you learn Latin.
Yes.
By hearing it every Sunday. I
think it's gone too far that way, and it's veering back.
I was glad of my Bible education. I was officially an Anglican, but brought up in Australia as a Presbyterian, because that was the closest church to home, and my mother wanted to get me out of trouble on Sundays. But it did have one magnificent advantage, is I heard the King James Version of the Bible every Sunday, read it aloud, got prizes, learned it. And I was unable to do that for my own children. Even in the Protestant churches, the retreat from the old-time liturgy, in fact, especially in the Protestant churches, the retreat was precipitate. And you can't send your children off on Sunday to hear the Revised Standard Version of the Bible or the Happy Clappy version, whatever. They're not even hearing good prose.
No.
And
the Jerusalem Bible is very good. I mean, that's the Bible I read, and it's well written, intelligent, and I think, I mean, I admire the King James Version for its prose, the beauty of its prose, but I do think it's very difficult sometimes to understand what is being said because of the ancient language. And I mean, I would encourage people to read the Jerusalem Version, which tells the story in a very clear way.
I don't want anyone to think that I underrate for a moment the importance of the Catholic faith in the world, and it became very clear when the Pope went to Poland in 1982, because one of the things that brought the Soviet Union finally to give up was Poland in 1982, and that wouldn't have happened without the Pope. So I don't underestimate that force at all, but I find it very hard to accept the Catholic Church ever in its history as the force of enlightenment.
I think you're unfair.
But there was such a thing as tolerance as a concept. There always has been. It's just the church itself could never be very good at it because
There was
orthodoxy
no-
meant it so
there
much.
was no concept of religious tolerance in the 16th century.
There were individual people. Montaigne was a tolerant man.
Yes,
Montaigne planned no burnings in his library. He had a library like this, only better.
yes.
And what he concluded from his reading was that to carry faith à l'outrance, as it were, to the point of imposing death on those who disagreed.
Because
was
he'd
a
seen
real
the terrible consequences of the wars of religion.
Yes.
Yeah, but if they'd been able to stamp out that fire
Early.
early enough,
Killed the right people.
yeah. Who was it who said they should have just put Luther into prison and thrown away the key?
Well, considering Luther's record on the Jews, I would have agreed with him, because Luther was a prince of intolerance. It's just nobody notices because he was an anti-Semite. And
Yeah, I just think you've got to be very careful of judging the past by our standards
I agree with
today.
that. Dr. Hindsight is a useless companion.
Yeah.
I agree. I just resist the view that there was never such a thing as an independent mind. There were, but it was hard to hear from them because they were hunted down and killed, or they didn't really stand much of a chance against the organisation. The church was an organised
People who were
orthodoxy.
hunted down and killed weren't independent minds. They were people who wanted everyone to stop being Catholic and become Protestants. I mean, Calvin burnt people. Luther,
sure did,
Luther
yes.
certainly was responsible for most.
Calvin actually burned other Protestants if they were the right kind.
Yes, there was no.
He was the real forecast of the 20th century, and Stefan Zweig wrote a marvellous book about exactly that, how Calvin's natural reaction to anyone who disagreed with him, even on Protestant points of orthodoxy, should be put to the fire instantly.
Yeah. So to sort of postulate that the alternative to Catholic orthodoxy was kind of tolerance and liberal democracy is just historically not
You've
true.
got to forgive me for my own pedigree. I'm an Australian. I was brought up in Australia in the late 50s. It was still a censored country. Censored. And Catholicism had a lot to do with censorship.
Yeah.
And the idea of the index expurgatorium was slow to die. In fact,
Yeah.
it's still there, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's quite possible to imagine the church, for example, taking one of your own books and deciding to ban it. It
Yes.
might have happened if the
Yes.
church had been powerful enough.
If I'd lived 100 years earlier, they would certainly have banned my books. In
then what
fact,
was
if I'd lived 40 years earlier, they'd probably have banned my books.
Would you have?
Graham Greene, one of Graham Greene's books was on the index.
And what did he say? He said, "Well, I'm a real Catholic, more Catholic than
I think
the Vatican."
when he met Pope Paul VI, I think Pope Paul was rather sort of bit sort of embarrassed by that.
But you'd rather have the orthodoxy there to relate to than to be fully, shall we say, independent. I'm not saying that you're giving up your independence, but you are saying that there's a standard to which you are related, and you can't create all your own standards by yourself.
No, I'm a very anti-clerical Catholic, and I think the sort of to have sort of stupid priests telling you what you should think and what you should write is appalling, and I think so would probably Thomas More have thought that, but I do think, as Chesterton said, that orthodoxy is the key to the understanding of human nature and of what it means to be truly human. And if you start saying, well, there's no such thing as orthodoxy, there's no such thing as truth, like Pilate, then I think humanity goes off in terrible directions.
Chesterton appeals to me too, and precisely because, for example, he said tradition and democracy were the same thing. I believe it. And he also said that if you give up believing in something, you'll start believing anything.
Which is
true.
only too true.
He wasn't just being a paradox monger. He was telling the truth. Now, Catholicism has a rich literary tradition, and you're part of it. But a lot of that tradition depends on not accepting the concept of orthodoxy, but trying to modify it, subtleize it, and even rebel against it constantly.
Yeah. Well, I've done that, I think. I mean, my novels, as I say, are very sort of sometimes satirize the church and are full of paradox. And I don't think having Catholic belief and having religious values behind your writing means that you're going to write religious propaganda.
What about social values? I think in your mind, as I read your novels, you're very, very comfortable in, for example, the Austro-Hungarian Empire when it was a unity and so on. And one thing we know is that kind of society will never come again.
No. It's surprising how much it survives in Britain.
I was going to raise that. I was reading just now a marvellous little book of aphorisms that Adorno put together towards the end of the war. as so often with philosophers, the Little Book of Aphorisms is his best book. It was called Minima Moralia, I think. And he said, nobody's heard of it. At least of all the Adorno students, they don't like it. It's not like him. But he said that the strength of British culture, political culture and artistic culture, was that so many of its principles didn't need to be stated and therefore falsified because everybody simply accepted them and lived them, that they were woven into the texture of society. I think he had rather an old-time view of society, rather like Evelyn Waugh's, was based on country houses and good manners and gentility.
It's amazing how much that survives in Britain. I mean, you know, I was brought up in North Yorkshire for quite sort of odd reasons, which is, well, my father was the son of a farmer and he had this great nostalgia for his rural youth, and we moved back there in 1949 when I was 8. And it was like a sort of museum, and you know, Jane Austen, you know, would have been the sort of chronicler of those the 1950s and 1960s, and still, I mean, it's amazing how the sort of Jane Austen world does survive in British county society.
I've been accused of being a snob myself, and not always by Australians, but frequently because I'm judged to have a certain susceptibility for the country house ethos, the landed gentry, especially the cultivated ones. But I'm damned if I can see why not. But they did raise certain civilized values to a
yes, but on the other hand, I do think the British, I mean, I'm fairly antipathetic towards the sort of upper-class culture. I think the British have a sort of, or the English in particular, have a way of condescending and always putting you in the wrong, and you know, you're never wearing the right thing, or saying the right thing, or eating the right thing, or eating at the right time, or drinking the right drink. And you know, I went to Cambridge and thought that was brilliant, but then it was the wrong Cambridge College. You know, you were always...
You're not like an Englishman in that way, are you?
There's a sort of pinnacle that you never reach in English society.
It's something I want to get back to, because I shouldn't agree with you too quickly. Let's do it again. Thank you so much. Here's Paul Reed. Jay.
Thanks.